So today I wanted to talk about kind of a sensitive subject, just some of the weird things that happen when you're a minority. And of course, I'm speaking from the perspective of a woman who is considered black, um, and I live in the deep South in the USA. So that's kind of it's a tough place to be when you're a minority. And that said, not all minorities look like me. There are men who are minorities, maybe because of their skin color, their ethnicity, um, their sexual orientation, whether they're deaf. That is also considered a minority, being deaf. So you don't have to look like me to be a minority. Everybody goes through something. Even people who aren't minorities go through difficult and weird situations. So please don't think that this video is like, I'm not trying to say that I have it harder than other people. This is just my personal experience, that's all. And I think it's weird and it's uncomfortable sometimes. Okay, so all of that said, some of the weird things that have happened that really just kind of like, I don't know, take a huge chunk out of yourself, or have taken a huge chunk out of my self-esteem, are just realizing, for one, how other people see me. Um, like growing up, I didn't think about race that much. I honestly did not, because my family, we just didn't talk about it that much. Like my dad was raised in Louisiana here, so he did talk about it because he has been through some stuff being a black man in the deep South. That's hard. But my mother, she is light skinned, and sadly that makes a difference, in the way you're treated. And she's not from the South. She's from like Manhattan and New York. So her experiences with racism were very different from mine and my father's. Um, and she kind of like she ran our household basically. She had a huge part in raising um, us, me and my brother. So we grew up not really thinking about race that much or talking about it, and we had friends of like all different ethnicities. And little kids, you put your arm up to your friend and you're like, "Oh, I'm darker than you," and you talk about it, but you don't really think about it. So that was me. And then I think sometimes being an INFP, I talk about that a lot on this channel. Being an INFP, you can be a little bit naive sometimes and not realize certain things that are glaringly obvious to other people, or maybe that's just me, I don't know. So when people would say things about race, as a child and even as a young adult, when I got older, it would just go over my head. Like I didn't realize I was being put down. Like, of course I did. Like when people would call me the N word, that I was like, oh wow, hmm, they're talking about me. That went through my thick skull. But other things like being a little kid and I'm playing with my friends at school and just talking and laughing and whatever. And then they're like, "You're different from other black people. You're nice." And I would be like, "Thank you." And I didn't realize that was like, I guess a backhanded, no, not a backhanded compliment. It wasn't even that. It was a put down, and I didn't realize that. I just knew that I felt weird when my friends at school would say that. And they would do and say other things too that just kind of went over my head. I knew I felt bad, but I didn't really understand why. Um, I'm kind of rambling. I'm sorry about that. But I guess like as I got older, it's sort of because I was so naive and just didn't really think about the impact that race has on a person, and I guess the impact that like prejudice can have on a person. Because I didn't really think about it much when I got older and wasn't a cute kid anymore. I'm a black woman in the working world. I did start to realize, like, for one, here's one thing that was really weird. I would get lowballed as far as pay goes in the workplace. Other people always made more than me. And usually those other people were not the same skin color as me. Like I remember one of my first jobs after high school, because I had a job while I was in high school. It was wonderful. I loved that little job. But after, I went to a little college and graduated and got my first little job in a doctor's office. The doctor who I worked for, he offered me like, I think it was $8 or $9 an hour. It was horribly, horribly low for, someone who had their little certificate as a trained medical assistant. That's what I was. And, he wouldn't have offered that to someone who looked different from me. But, and the office manager, in fact, when she gave me the offer, when she presented the offer to me, she was like, I am so sorry. She was very sweet. And she was ashamed. But I took it because I knew that someone who looked like me, I was starting to realize things, put two and two together, and starting to realize that someone who looked like me would have a very hard time finding a job in a doctor's office. Um, so I just took it, and the doctor was not very nice. He liked to make fun of me, and I noticed that when he hired women usually. Other women, they were different races. They were not dark skinned like me, and they got paid more, and he treated them much better, but he would make fun of me. So that was a little weird. But again, I am very naive. I'm sensitive, but naive. So sometimes insults just go right over my head. Now, in retrospect, I'm looking back and I'm thinking, oh man, he insulted me like every day. But usually I just be like, oh, okay, whatever, and keep doing my work. So, yeah, that's one of the weird things is like just realizing that it isn't your education, it isn't your personality, but just the way you look means that you're going to get paid less than the people around you and get treated with less respect. The same thing happened when I worked in news. I noticed that, especially at one particular news station, which I had some very fond memories of working there, but one thing that was not a fond memory is I realized that a lot of the women who look like me, um, you know, uh, the darker skinned black women, we did a lot of the work, a lot of it, but we typically, were paid less than the men around us and the people who were not dark skinned black women, typically, for the most part. Um, and we were yelled at frequently. We were called lazy, even though we were not. Um, and one thing I also noticed, which I thought was really interesting, when I would look around the newsroom, a lot of times I would notice that even though I was not in front of the camera, and my colleagues, quite a few of my colleagues who were dark-skinned black women, were not in front of the camera either. We were like producers and writers. We would come to work dressed like we worked in, I don't know, what's a nice place, like somewhere super fancy. We would dress pretty fancy. Um, but our colleagues did not because they didn't have anything to prove. They were accepted. And that's why what I think the reason was as black women in the South, I think we're used to not being accepted, being made fun of, being paid less. So a lot of times we try to show up, like we overdress. We speak differently when we're at work, like we try to enunciate our words so we don't look dumb because we assume that people are going to think we're dumb, which unfortunately, sadly, is true. Um, so we just kind of go overboard in trying to deliver. And unfortunately, it doesn't work. That's one thing. I know this is so negative and I'm sorry, but this is just the truth. Um, I kept being told at that particular news station, I would work like 10, 12 hours a day. A lot of us did. A lot of us did. And I kept being told, you're going to get promoted. It's okay. You're going to get promoted. Never did. Never did. So I had to leave because I couldn't pay my rent. I couldn't afford food. I couldn't afford toilet paper. Even though I was working like extra, extra, extra. And it wasn't just me. This is like all the black women there, basically. Um, and slowly we would we'd leave because if you can't pay your rent, if you're being made fun of and insulted and overworked, why stay? So that's something that has sadly, it's just a weird thing that's kind of like followed me my whole adult life. Um, Being paid less than the people around me. And I don't think this is something that only black women deal with. Let me make that very clear. I think a lot of people who are minorities deal with this too. And it's so frustrating. It's like you can never get ahead. And I think a lot of times it boils down to the way that we look, the color of our skin, or a disability, or whatever it is, something about our appearance. Um, and another weird thing is like trying to find a place to live. It comes up in that scenario too. Like there is a particular place that was right across from the other news station where I used to work. And when I started my job at the other news station, I was like, oh, finally I can move into this, kind of nice, exclusive apartment complex because it was literally almost like I could have walked to work. And I knew that other journalists who worked at the same news station lived there too. So I went in to apply. Before I could get the words out of my mouth, I was sent out the door. And when I talked to other people about it, they were like, "Oh, they don't accept black people." So I was like, "Okay." And that sounds shocking, but it isn't because there's another experience that happened, like when I was trying to find an apartment a few years back, and I was pretty desperate. So I was like, anything, as long as it's clean, I'm good. And a friend of mine who is not the same ethnicity as me, she's white. She was like, "Oh, you can live where I think it's where she used to live, or either she and her husband are living there now." And she's so sweet, so I trusted her, and she gave me her landlord's phone number. So I talked to her landlord on the phone. We had a really nice conversation, and I was pumped because I was like, I'm finally gonna have a place to live. Yay! And the rent was low, and it was a okay area, not terrible. So we arranged a meeting so she could show me the apartment. I met the lady, and when she saw me, her face was like, what is this? She apparently on the phone, she thought that I was white. But when I showed up and she saw a black woman, she was like, uh-uh. And when she talked to me, she literally looked me up and down and said, okay, you seem nice, but what kind of men are you going to bring here? That's literally the words that came out of my mouth. In other words, she did not want black men in her apartment complex. So I was shocked when she reacted that way and said that and kept saying little things like that. But I kept it to myself because I don't know. I don't feel like fighting with people. Who has the energy for that? Oh, because I would be fighting with people every day. So I was just like, okay, all right, thank you. And I left and never talked to that woman again. But things like that happen a lot. And it is such a blow to self-esteem. And honestly, I have quite a few videos about this because it's just something I need to get off my chest every now and then, just something I really need to talk about. And I'm still trying to work through the process of, I guess, telling myself over and over again, it's not me, it's them. And if you take it a step further, it's not them. It's not the people who are prejudiced, it is our society. It's the media, sadly. It's the people in positions of power who are not making changes that need to be made. And that trickles down to the everyday average people like me and my neighbors who don't trust me because of the color of my skin. Um, it affects all of us. So I feel like people who are prejudiced and racist who really struggle with that and who oftentimes don't even realize that they're racist, I feel like they are victims too. They are victims of the culture that we live in that puts people down based on the way they look, that has enslaved groups of people um, for years and then expected those people to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. We don't have bootstraps. We still get treated like slaves in the Deep South. So it's just, it's like this hamster wheel of constantly trying to get ahead, but you can't because the mindset around here is just so terrible when it comes to race. So I'm saying a lot of things today. I hope that none of this offended anyone. If it did, I am sorry. I'm just trying to be honest. Uh, it's just because it's really hard, and sometimes I just have to talk about this, and I don't want to like constantly talk about this to friends who don't understand and who will think I'm just complaining. So I get on here and talk about it. Um, if you have experiences or if you have a positive way to deal with racism, please feel free to leave a comment because I think that would help. Not just me, it would help a lot of people. Because it really just sucks. It really sucks when it feels like everyone around you thinks that you're crap because of the way you look. I mean, after, doesn't that affect, wouldn't that affect somebody? It affects me for sure. So um, I think that's all I have to say about that in the words of Forrest Gump. All right, sorry this was so negative. I'm sorry. Ugh. But thank you for watching. And if you want to put up with my negativity, you can subscribe. That was a horrible plug, but subscribe to my channel and like this video. Bye. Thanks for watching.